10th April 1970. Britain woke to news that felt like the world had tilted slightly off its axis and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Paul McCartney had announced the Beatles were finished, done, split up, over. Four boys from Liverpool who'd conquered the world and changed music forever had decided they couldn't stand being in the same room together anymore. The announcement came buried in a press release for Paul's solo album, a few casual sentences that destroyed something millions of people had believed would last forever. The Beatles are dead, the statement said, and there would be no reunion, no comeback, no fixing what had broken. This is the story of the day the music died and how Britain mourned four Liverpool boys who'd given them everything before taking it all away. The news broke in the morning papers on Good Friday, which meant most people discovered it over breakfast while the rest of the country was closed for the Easter holiday. In Liverpool, 17-year-old Susan Miller sat at her kitchen table reading the Daily Mirror when she saw the headline and felt her stomach drop in a way she couldn't quite explain. She'd been 11 years old in 1964 when the Beatles had appeared on Ready, Steady, Go and changed her entire understanding of what music could be. And for 6 years, they'd been the constant soundtrack to her teenage life. Every album was an event. Every single was analyzed and memorized. Every photograph was cut out and stuck on her bedroom wall until the wallpaper underneath disappeared completely. Except Susan hadn't grown out of it, and now sitting at the kitchen table on Good Friday morning, reading that the Beatles had split, she realized she'd been expecting them to last forever, without ever consciously thinking about it. In Manchester, 44-year-old Robert Thompson read the same news in his living room and felt something close to genuine grief settle over him like a heavy blanket. Robert was too old to be a Beatles fan in the way teenagers were, but he'd watched them grow from local Liverpool boys playing the Cavern Club to the biggest band in human history, and their success had felt like proof that working-class British kids could achieve absolutely anything. When the Beatles had conquered America in 1964, when they'd filled Shea Stadium with 55,000 screaming fans, when they'd released Sgt. Pepper and changed what popular music could be, it had felt like a victory for everyone who'd grown up in terraced houses and council estates and been told their entire lives that people like them didn't matter. The Beatles had mattered more than anything, and now they were gone. And Robert sat in his living room on Good Friday morning feeling like he'd lost something he hadn't known he needed so desperately. In London, 23-year-old Jenny Wilson was still in bed when her flatmate burst into her room waving the newspaper and shouting that the Beatles had split up. Jenny had been at the Our World broadcast in 1967 when the Beatles had performed All You Need Is Love live to 400 million people watching on television across the globe, and she remembered the feeling of being part of something historically significant, of watching four men from Liverpool unite the entire world through music for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. She'd believed in that moment that music could actually change things, that the Beatles represented something bigger than just entertainment, that maybe love really was all you needed. Now lying in bed 3 years later, hearing that the Beatles had broken up, Jenny felt that belief crack and crumble. And she wondered if she'd been naive to ever think four people making music together could represent anything more than four people making music together. The story of the Beatles had started a decade earlier in Liverpool, when four working-class boys had formed a band that nobody outside their immediate circle had cared about at all. John Lennon was the smart-mouthed art school dropout with a chip on his shoulder and a guitar he'd learned to play from a mail-order instruction book. Paul McCartney was the pretty-faced charmer who could write melodies that got stuck in your head for days and harmonies that made other musicians weep with jealousy. George Harrison was the quiet one who joined the band at 14 and spent years being treated like the kid brother before proving he could write songs just as good as John and Paul's. Ringo Starr was the replacement drummer who joined in 1962 and fit so perfectly it seemed impossible they'd ever had anyone else. Together, they'd played hundreds of shows in Liverpool and Hamburg, grinding away in basement clubs for audiences who were usually too drunk to care, slowly developing the sound and the chemistry that would eventually change everything. The breakthrough had come in 1962 when Brian Epstein had convinced EMI to give them an audition, and when producer George Martin had heard something in their rough demo tapes that nobody else could quite articulate. Within a year, they'd released Please Please Me and She Loves You, And suddenly, four Liverpool boys were the biggest thing in Britain, screamed at by teenagers and dismissed by adults who thought they were a fad that would disappear within months. But the Beatles hadn't disappeared. They'd gotten bigger and better and more ambitious with every release. By 1964, they'd conquered America with an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show that 73 million people watched, and suddenly British music mattered in ways it never had before. The Beatles had kicked open a door that had been locked for decades, and behind them came the Rolling Stones and the Who and the Kinks and dozens of other British bands who suddenly had careers because four boys from Liverpool had proven it was possible. The peak had come between 1965 and 1967, when the Beatles had released Rubber Soul and Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Albums that weren't just collections of singles, but complete artistic statements that changed what popular music could be and do. Sgt. Pepper in particular had felt like a cultural earthquake, an album so ambitious and experimental and perfectly executed that even people who hated the Beatles had to admit they'd created something genuinely important. The album had topped charts around the world, won multiple Grammy Awards, and been declared by critics as the greatest record ever made by anyone anywhere. For a brief perfect moment in 1967, the Beatles had been the center of global culture, four working-class boys from Liverpool who'd somehow captured what an entire generation was feeling and made it into music that would last forever. But success that complete and overwhelming had come with pressures that nobody could have anticipated or prepared for. By 1968, the cracks were starting to show, with John and Paul fighting over creative direction, and George feeling increasingly marginalized, and Ringo so frustrated he'd temporarily quit during the White Album sessions. The magic that had made them the Beatles was disappearing under the weight of egos and disagreements, and the simple fact that four people who'd spent nearly every day together for a decade were sick of being around each other. Their manager, Brian Epstein, had died in 1967, and without him, there was nobody to mediate disputes or keep them focused on making music instead of fighting about business decisions. The recording sessions for Let It Be in 1969 had been so tense and unpleasant that cameras filming a planned documentary had captured the band falling apart in real time. Four men who clearly couldn't stand being in the same room pretending to still be friends for the sake of appearances. By early 1970, everyone close to the Beatles knew the end was coming, but the public announcement on April 10th still felt shocking and final in a way that rumors and speculation hadn't. Paul McCartney's press release was characteristically blunt and casual, answering a series of questions about his future plans, with statements that made it clear the Beatles were over. "I don't really foresee a time when I will be writing with John again," Paul had written, and those 10 words destroyed something that millions of people had believed was unbreakable. The band that had represented youth and optimism and the possibility that four ordinary people could change the world was finished, gone, never coming back. In Liverpool that Good Friday morning, Susan Miller's mother found her sitting at the kitchen table with tears running down her face, and when she asked what was wrong, Susan just pointed at the newspaper headline and couldn't find words to explain why this mattered so much. Her mother, who'd spent years complaining about the noise of Beatles records being played too loud upstairs, sat down next to her daughter and put an arm around her shoulders without saying anything at all. She didn't understand why four men breaking up a band would make her teenage daughter cry, but she understood that the grief was real and that sometimes you didn't need to understand pain to acknowledge it existed. They sat together in silence while Susan cried over people she'd never met, mourning the loss of something that had felt permanent until it wasn't. In Manchester, Robert Thompson folded the newspaper carefully and set it on the coffee table and just sat there staring at nothing in particular. His wife Margaret came into the living room and saw his expression and knew immediately something was wrong. "What's happened?" she asked, and Robert gestured at the newspaper and said, "The Beatles have split up," in a voice that sounded flat and defeated. Margaret had expected him to say someone had died or there'd been an accident or something genuinely terrible, and her first instinct was to say it's just a band. It doesn't matter. But she looked at her husband's face and saw real sadness there, saw how much this actually did matter to him, even if she couldn't understand why. And so instead of dismissing it, she sat down next to him and said, "I'm sorry," and meant it. In London, Jenny Wilson got out of bed and went to the living room, where her flatmate had turned on the radio, hoping for more information. Every station was talking about the Beatles split, playing their songs back to back while DJs tried to process what this meant for music and culture and Britain itself. Jenny and her flatmate sat on the couch listening to Hey Jude play on the radio, and when it ended, there was a long moment of silence before the DJ came back on and said, "Well, that's that then," in a voice heavy with finality. The reactions across Britain that Good Friday ranged from genuine grief to dismissive indifference depending on how old you were and how much the Beatles had meant to you during the previous decade. Teenagers who'd grown up with the Beatles as the soundtrack to their adolescence felt like they'd lost something fundamental and irreplaceable. Young adults who'd watched the Beatles evolve from mop-top pop stars to serious artists felt like a chapter of their lives had closed permanently. Older people who'd never understood what the fuss was about in the first place wondered why everyone was so upset over four musicians deciding to work separately instead of together. But even people who didn't care about the Beatles recognized that something had shifted in British culture, that an era had definitively ended, and whatever came next would be fundamentally different. The weekend that followed was strange and melancholic in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Radio stations played nothing but Beatles songs for days, and everywhere you went you could hear "Yesterday" or "Let It Be" or "Come Together" floating out of windows and car radios, the familiar songs taking on new significance now that there would never be any new ones. In Liverpool especially, the sense of loss felt personal and profound, as if the city had lost something that belonged to them specifically even though the Beatles had belonged to everyone. The weeks and months that followed saw endless speculation about whether the Beatles might reunite, whether this was just a temporary break that would eventually be resolved, whether John and Paul would work out their differences and get the band back together. Every interview with any of the 4ex-Beatles was analyzed for hints that a reunion was possible. Every casual comment was interpreted as either hope or confirmation that it was truly over forever. But as time passed and the four men started successful solo careers, it became increasingly clear that the Beatles really were finished and no amount of fan desire or media speculation would bring them back. In 1980, any lingering hope of a reunion ended permanently when John Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment building in New York City by a man who'd asked for his autograph hours earlier. The news of John's death hit Britain like a physical blow, and suddenly the grief over the Beatles splitting a decade earlier was revived and intensified by the realization that now a reunion was literally impossible. Susan Miller, now 27 years old and working as a teacher in Liverpool, heard the news on the radio and immediately thought back to that Good Friday morning in 1970 when she'd cried over her mother's kitchen table, and she realized she'd been mourning something that had actually died that day, even if she hadn't known it yet. What was lost when the Beatles split in April 1970? More than just a band and more than just music. There was the optimism they'd represented, the belief that four working-class boys from Liverpool could conquer the world through talent and hard work and sticking together. There was the unity they'd created, the way their music had brought together people of different ages and backgrounds and countries who might have had nothing else in common. There was the evolution they'd represented, starting as simple pop stars and transforming into serious artists who proved that popular music could be as sophisticated and meaningful as any other art form. There was the hope they'd embodied, particularly for young people in the 1960s, who'd believed that maybe their generation really could change the world for the better. But most of all, what was lost was the simple joy of having something to look forward to, the anticipation of the next Beatles album or single or tour that had been a constant presence in British life for nearly a decade. For 8 years between 1962 and 1970, there had always been new Beatles music coming, always something to anticipate and discuss and analyze and love. When that stopped, when the announcement came that there would be no more Beatles records or concerts or moments where four Liverpool boys stood together and created magic, it left a void that nothing else could quite fill. Do you remember where you were when you heard the Beatles had split? Do you remember the feeling of reading that headline or hearing it on the radio and realizing something fundamental had ended? Do you remember the posters on your bedroom wall, or the records you'd saved up to buy, or the concerts you'd attended or wished you'd attended? Do you remember believing they'd last forever, even though nothing lasts forever? Do you remember the music and how it made you feel and how it brought people together in ways that seem impossible now? If you remember any of this, then the Beatles aren't completely gone. They're still there in the memory of what British music used to be, in the story of four Liverpool boys who changed everything before falling apart. Share your memories of the Beatles in the comments below. Tell us your favorite song, your favorite album, where you were when they split, what they meant to you. Subscribe for more stories about the legends who defined British culture and the moments when everything changed.